Who is it?
It's the plumber.
Plumber? I didn't call a plumber.
Hello and welcome to episode 26 of Skeptic Smash Talk. I'm your host, Jason Jones, and joining me once again is my long-suffering wife, Andy. Welcome back.
Hi there.
Now, before we get too far, please be aware that this podcast is classified as explicit, so if you're easily offended, it's probably best if you turn off now. Now, if you want to get in touch, you'll find all the links for email, Facebook, and Twitter, and even links to the YouTube channel at skepticsmashtalk.com. There you'll find all the show notes, and you can even play the latest episodes right from the front page. And finally, if you want to help support the show, please go to iTunes or your favorite podcast app and leave a 5-star review and continue to share the show details with all of your friends. So with that out of the way, let's get on with the show. Now, before we get too far into the show, I do need to make a correction and an apology from last week. Now, when we were talking about yoga and the philosophy of yoga, I kept saying instead of Hindu, I kept saying Hindi, which is obviously not correct. Hindi is the language of Hindus. Is that right, Andrea?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that we should talk about is both of us sound a little bit tired today because we had a fairly large gathering at home here yesterday. What did we have? 14 people in the house?
Yeah.
And hilarity ensued.
And a lot of food. Thank you very much, Jason.
My pleasure. My pleasure
I'm
indeed.
very tired now.
Very tired. So, Andrea, the Olympics are all but over.
Yes, they are. I'm ready to start the Paralympics, I believe now.
If they start.
They did say they were going to, but with an extremely reduced budget.
It's a real shame that actually, because, well, there's a few problems that they've had, and obviously ticket sales have been a problem. But 3 weeks gap between the Olympics and the Special Olympics.
Do you know what? I don't even blame.
I keep
the host
saying
country.
Special Olympics. It's not the Special Olympics. It's the Paralympics.
Yeah, it is. I actually don't blame the host country at all. I blame media across the world, because if all we hear is about the Olympics and main stars like your Mo Farahs and your Usain Bolt and Jennifer Ellis, what's the name?
Ennis Hill?
Yeah.
You are tired, aren't you?
There is a Jennifer Ellis. She's an actress, I think.
That's Jennifer Anderson.
No, there is a Jennifer Ellis.
Okay.
And she used to be in Brookside, I think. I don't know. I might have lied. That could be a total lie. Anyway, back. Because I do believe that if they actually made these Paralympics as equal in popularity standing, therefore they'd have that interest.
Yeah.
You'd advertise it more.
Oh, of course.
And yourself, you're going to buy tickets for something you know more about.
I just don't see the reason. Now, what's probably not well known is that whoever's hosting the Olympics doesn't necessarily by default get the Paralympics. It's they still bid and are awarded the Paralympics.
Oh, right, okay.
But I don't remember. I've not looked up to see, but I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. I don't recall a time where the Paralympics have been completely separate from the Olympics. But there's no reason, I can't see a reason why you can't have, instead of having the Olympics on for 2 weeks, have it on for 2.5 or 3 weeks and integrate the two in together.
How good would that be?
I know,
you'd have the same resources. You're not telling me that the track is used
exactly
for the whole entire time, or I don't know. That would be so much better if they could do that, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Now, I've not actually been to an Olympics, but I've been to World Series and World Cups and things like that. We went to the Velodrome to watch the UK Championships, and there's a lot of downtime, for athletes.
There is. Yeah.
Obviously now one of the things that was annoying me last week was we had like 20 minutes of watching people getting ready for a 10-second race or 9.8-second race in some instances. So all that time could be used to actually, for the Paralympics, and actually run them in conjunction. But we'll see. I can't imagine that will ever happen.
No, I don't either. And it's a shame.
Now, you also, you enlightened me, I didn't know this actually, that the Americans, amongst other people, actually, if they win, they end up getting slightly penalised by their own country by having to pay taxes.
Oh, their tax authorities on their winnings.
Yeah,
medal.
So I've got a list here. So, well, it's not that. So it's not that the Americans pay a lot. They do pay tax on the value of their medal.
But it's not like they're cashing it in for cash. So if you're a bit strapped for cash and all of a sudden you've got a tax bill for this medal that you've just won and got hanging on your neck. You've not sold it, have you?
No, but the medals themselves are not that valuable. I think maybe $1,000 or something like that. The bronze medals, practically worthless. It's the value of the metals that are in the medal. So the gold medal isn't pure gold. It's mostly silver and it's got a bit of gold plating. But the bronze medal is mostly copper, and that's not very valuable at the moment. But the stories that were going around this week was that the Americans pay it was just shy of $10,000 in taxes. But they also get, according to the Independent anyway, or Statista, they get about $25,000 payment.
So they get paid from their country.
Yeah.
When they win.
Exactly, yeah.
And I take it there's a sliding scale depending on what medal they win. Do they get something if they win silver and something if they win bronze? Yeah.
So the $25,000, that's for the gold medal, and the Germans
they'll get taxed on that surely as well, won't they?
That's that big tax that.
Oh, is that what they get taxed on? Not actually the medal being
They still get taxed on the medal, but it's the value of the medal is so low that it's not a lot anyway. So basically, it's still silly.
But they do get screwed twice, really.
Oh yeah. But so 25 grand for the Americans, and like I say, they pay tax on that. Singapore, guess how much they get paid? Like, if somebody wins a gold medal,
enlighten me.
$753,000 for a gold medal winner.
No wonder why they try so hard.
Yeah,
I would. Jeez, I'd give up the beer. I would get running.
No, you're being a bit silly now.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
The French, they get 66 grand.
Wow.
Who else we got here? Russia, 61,000. South Africa, 36,000.
Russia gets some drugs too, don't they?
Yeah.
Sorry.
They
Sorry.
they have the equivalent to the NHS for all their steroids and whatnot. Indonesia, $383,000 for a gold medal.
What does the Africans get? Because they do work really hard.
South Africans get 36,000. I've not got the Kenyans or anything like that. I'm not too sure if they get anything. Guess what the great British athletes get for all their hard work?
Zero.
Zilch. Yeah. Absolutely sweet fuck all.
Yeah.
And now the few headlines from the papers that you would expect it from, and now they've calculated it cost about £5 million pounds per gold medal that we won to
put it into them.
Yeah.
But don't forget all the people are inspiring to get out and actually get active, because it's not just about that, isn't it? It's about actually having your country say, do you know what, I want to do a bit of that. Or
look, we've got some real inspiring people now. Now, 4 years ago, with Brad Wiggins, more Brad than anybody else, with his success on the bike, you couldn't get onto the velodrome in Manchester.
No.
Now with Laura Trott and Jason Kenny, there is no way. When I was riding there, you'd have to book about a month in advance to get on there.
Yeah.
Which was really hard because you're booking a month in advance for a 1 hour time slot, and then I think could happen. That's going to stretch out to 3-4 months now.
Yeah, definitely. It's a shame then, because it makes it inaccessible. But
I think that the good thing with cycling is obviously the velodrome is where it's at, and riding in the velodrome is an exciting sport, but you can just get out on any old bike and just ride and enjoy it and things like that. Even with running, You know, we've got a 400-metre athletics track up the road from us, which you know, it's a couple of quid to go and use it if you're not it's a council-owned track, so it's cheap to actually use, or you can just run around the park.
And don't forget you get park runs, which are free.
Exactly.
So what was your highlights this week's Olympics?
I think there was two actually for me. So you remember the weightlifter? I can't remember his name now. He did his little dance.
Oh, the dancing dude, yeah.
The dancing dude. Now, as it turns out, as you would expect, it's not just a simple story like that. It turns out that he's doing that so that he can get some media attention. Obviously, everybody wants their media attention, but he's trying to get some media attention so he can talk to the media, and raise awareness of the problems that they've been having at home, with climate change. So he's actually lost his house, and his family lost their house due to rising sea levels, so it got washed away. So that's why
platform to do it, eh?
Yeah. And the other one, this is brilliant. This guy's going to have, if he doesn't have a athletics career, he's going to be well and truly made for the rest of his life. And that was the Japanese pole vaulter who lost out on his medals because of his cock. He knocked the pole down. And I'm not going to make any assumptions about anything here, but he will go home to a hero's welcome.
I don't think he'll do too bad.
He'll be all right. So there are two things that are very closely intertwined that I've realised I've been quite wrong about in the very recent past. Now, I don't mind admitting being wrong because that's how we learn, right? But I was very wrong, and I'm talking about minimum wages and employment choice. Now, employment choice is probably the simpler topic to cover, and it relates to the deeper part of this diatribe. So let's get that out of the way first. Now, I will be the first to admit that every time I hear somebody going on about how shitty the company is that they work for, I will think, or sometimes say, well, that's their choice. Nobody is holding a gun to their head, and if people walk away from shitty employers, then eventually the employer will go out of business, right? Well, that's wrong. There will always be somebody that desperately needs income that will do whatever they need to do to put food on the table. That's why society's underbelly look out for people in very deep financial shit to do their dirty work for them. Think of all the times you hear of a mule being caught. There are so many cases where it turns out that they were in deep shit, and in their minds, there was no other way out. Anyway, so it is what it is. Shitty employers will always find somebody desperate enough. And in the UK, just look at the poor sods at Sports Direct or Deliveroo, and over in the home of the brave, the very brave working at Walmart are getting fucked over so badly that their employers, in fact Walmart, are making money off them. What they have done, Walmart that is phenomenally outrageous. And it's a true sign of how industry owns politics. Let me explain how it happens at Walmart. Firstly, they pay their staff the minimum wage, and you can argue, and I have, and I was wrong, that this is okay because of the type of work it attracts students or first-time workers. And even if that were true, how is it right to pay somebody the minimum amount of money that you can legally get away with? However, when you look at the demographics of the workers in your local Walmart, or in the UK, we call it Asda, these are not college kids working their way through school. These are the mums and dads with families. We're seeing more and more men and women working in the stores here that should be enjoying retirement, but they are working in these stores for the absolute minimum amount of money that the company can get away with paying them. Now, there are different rules around benefits around the world, so let's just stick to America for now. And let's do some imagineering. So we have a mother working full-time, if she's lucky working full-time, and she just happens to work at Walmart. Let's imagine that this is a family's only income, and so being that she's under the federal poverty line, she thankfully gets assistance. Amongst other things, she'll get what's better known as food stamps. Now, assuming a family of four and assuming a hell of a lot of assumables, at best, this worker will get, at best, about $500 a month for food stamps, which still doesn't get her above the federal poverty line, but it's close. And so, just in case you missed it, Walmart have used the Social Security system to supplement its employees. Isn't it strange that we villainize the chumps that take the benefits and live off the system and takes whatever he or she can take, but no one looks at the larger businesses? They're doing the same thing. In 2014, Walmart staff were issued over $6.2 billion worth of food stamps. But that's not all. To avoid paying some of its taxes, Walmart exploits a legal loophole by paying its top executives massive performance bonuses. So essentially, the more it pays its executives, the less it pays in taxes. The taxes that go towards funding food stamps. Now, the Waltons, who happen to be the wealthiest family in America and the owners of Walmart, contribute almost none of their personal wealth to the charitable foundation that bears their name. Instead, they use the charity's tax structure to avoid paying an estimated $3 billion per year in taxes. Now that beggars belief. Rather than paying its workers a fair living wage, it pays its executives more and uses a charity structure so that they don't have to pay taxes. Surely the same tax incentives work for performance-based bonuses to the workers, right? Well, that's the third leg of the stool that makes all this a perfect little cottage business for the Waltons. In 2013, I'm using that year as all the figures I have are from 2013-2014. So in 2013, Walmart collected an estimated $13 billion in revenue from food stamps. And with an average gross profit over the last 3 years of about $120 billion, that's a tidy little chunk of their income. And you have to expect that a fair proportion of the $6.2 billion for the staff's food stamps gets spent in Walmart as well, right? So in round numbers, by exploiting loopholes and paying their staff the absolute minimum that they can get away with by law, the Waltons are $15 billion per year better off. What I can't find out is how much they pay to legislators to ensure this continues unimpeded. So what's this got to do with my hypothesis that workers can walk away from a shitty employer? Well, I refer you back to the genius of the highest order, Professor Richard Feynman. It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory, or in this case my theory, it doesn't matter how smart you are, or I am, if it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. Okay, I didn't do an experiment, but there's the observations. The observation that people are trudging in each day. You know trudging, the slow, weary, depressing yet determined walk of a person who has nothing left in life except the impulse to simply trudge on.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, Mama. Good night, Ben.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Mama. Good night, Daddy.
Good night, children.
Good night, Daddy. Good night, Elizabeth.
Good night, John Boy. Good night, Jim Bob. Good night, Jim Bob.
Good night, Jim Bob.
What's going on? I was asleep. What's everybody doing?
Which leads me to the minimum wage itself. Now, there was a time where I thought there was a need for lower paid workers, and again, I was wrong. And that statement there, lower paid workers, still has some merit. But lower than what? That, dear Capulet, is a question. Lower than what? First, let me explain my incorrect assumption. It's very simple, actually, and you would have heard this many a time from politicians. If you increase wages, people lose jobs. But as you may have come to expect, I wouldn't be telling you this little story if that was all there was to it. So recently there's been some attention over an economic study, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the media did, as the media is wont to do, reported what they wanted to report to get page clicks. And I'm paraphrasing all of them now, but they all went along the same but polar opposite lines. They said either studies show raising the minimum wage does not increase employment, which may be technically correct, or at the other end of the spectrum, they said studies don't agree with the claim that raising minimum wage increases employment. And that is also technically true, but we all know that these headlines were meant to deceive. What actually happened was economists looked at the data, and I don't have it at hand, but if you go and listen to the podcast called The Other Washington, they have a guy on episode 6 that actually looked at the numbers and was a part of the synopsis of the study. And what he suggests is that there is no correlation with low or high wages and unemployment, or that raising the minimum wage correlates with job losses. And that's the claim made by the politicians. Politicians that, because of cases like Citizens United, means that businesses such as the Waltons have unscrupulous influence on public policy. But the data does show that there are many instances where the economy has flourished in the years after minimum wage increases. And doesn't that make sense? If the people with the least money spend all of their money just to live, and the people with the vast riches, the 1%ers, they don't spend any of their money, or when they do, they purchase another piece of crap piece of art from another rich twat. These are the people that never pay when they go out because everybody wants to be in the good graces of the wealthy. Do you think the word remembers or the reasonably attractive people pay for anything when they go out in LA? Now, in 2009, as the financial crisis was starting to affect the land down under, the Australian government gave $1,000 to every taxpayer. Essentially, it was a loan, as taxes were going to have to increase slightly to cover this over the next 10 years. But the premise was that everybody was to take that money and spend it locally. And this is a brilliant idea. It's like quantitative easing without printing money or devaluing the currency. And it would have worked brilliantly if we all didn't take that money and spend it on big screen TVs from South Korea or beach holidays in Bali. Personally, I took mine and booked a flight with a UAE airline into England. And I'll put a link to the interview with Nick Hanauer on the Young Turks, which actually leads to the information that's in the Other Washington podcast. But what he is saying in the interview is that if they increase the minimum wage, the top 1%ers, of which he is one of, will also benefit. He puts it like this: if the minimum wage is calculated as a fraction of the CEO's total remuneration, the minimum wage workers want the boss to do well, really well. So they all work to achieve this. In that way, everybody wins. But if you did it any other way, it would be open to corruption and deception as it is now. It really is that simple. The boss gets his $1 billion bonus, the workers' wages go up accordingly. But why won't anyone do this? Well, in part because for it to work, everybody has to do it. It has to be across the board. But also, you need to cap company profits, or our CEOs will simply increase the wholesale price, which means the retail price of a loaf of bread will have a similar ratio as it is now compared to the minimum wage. And when you consider the Walton family controls a fortune equal to the wealth of the bottom 42% of Americans combined. Now, let me say that again. The Walton family controls a fortune equal to all the money that the bottom 42% of American earners have combined. You know they don't give a rat's ass about the price of a loaf of bread. So, will this mad idea work? Well, of course it will. It has. It started with Henry Ford and his $5 working day, and it worked in America up until about the 1960s. Every worker was paid according to the company's productivity. And then it all changed. So if you want to make America great again, get rid of corporate greed, get rid of admiring people because they have all the money, and pay workers in a way that shows that you are just a little bit grateful that they have enabled you to purchase yet another piece of shitty twatty art from your shitty twatty friend. Let's leave it with this thought. You know why countries have minimum wage laws? It's because they need them. They need them to protect the workers from the likes of the Waltons that as a family have as much wealth as, and I'm rounding this to the closest million, I hope you don't mind, the Waltons have as much wealth as 134 million Americans. So, Andrew, you said something to me very wise a couple of times, actually, but quite recently. Obviously. And it's that what you're saying, I'm paraphrasing you now, is that we skeptics can hold what certain people say is gospel as much as the deeply religious do. And in pretty much all respects, you're quite correct.
Yep, I believe so.
Now, what we normally call that is a logical fallacy. It's called an argument from authority. I'll explain that better in a second. But last week, Professor Brian Cox, was on the TV in Australia talking about climate change, and the logical fallacies were many and abundant. Now, I've got some recordings here, and it's quite long, so I've cut it into little chunks, and we're not going to play the whole lot. But there's a panel of people, and on the panel, obviously, you'll hear Professor Cox. You'll recognise his voice, and the other main voice that you'll hear there is Malcolm Roberts. And before I get too far into the logical fallacies, Roberts is a dumbass of the highest order and probably should never be listened to. The problem is, he's a member of the Australian Senate. Anyway, so all of this starts with a question from the audience, obviously pre-prepared or pre-approved, but that's not what's important. Let's just have a listen and we'll come back and talk about it.
Hello. Recently on Insiders, Malcolm Roberts gave Barry Cassidy his business card and asked Barry to get back to him when he had proof and data that there is a human element in our increasing climate change. I was hoping the panel could perhaps guide Barry with some fact and just not opinion on the human element in climate change.
Okay, so for clarity, Barry Cassidy is a veteran Australian political journalist, as well as a radio and TV host and presenter and commentator who has worked in the industry for 47 years. Malcolm Roberts, as I said before, the dumbass of the highest order, is an ex-coal miner and coal mine manager, and he has an undergrad degree in engineering and an MBA. He was also on the board of Montessori Limited, the nurseries, and was a principal of Consensus Proprietary Limited, and they're like a management consultancy firm. He's worked as a keynote speaker and a consultant on human freedom and leadership and productivity. And the human freedom part worries me a little bit, as he's a member of Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party. And for anybody not from Australia, so you know, One Nation makes UKIP look like Sesame Street. Its namesake, the mother of us all, and yes, she did say that, also said that criticism is not racism when talking about her statements criticising ethnic minorities on the subject of immigration and race. She even made one of those videos where it starts with, "If you're watching this tape, then I've been murdered." Now, One Nation itself, a few years back, were in quite deep shit when Stephanie Bannister was running as a One Nation candidate in the federal elections for the lower house, gave an interview to Channel 7 in which she A, referred to Islam as a country, B, claimed that Jewish people worship Jesus Christ, C, confused the Muslim Quran with the Islamic term for sin, which is haram, and made numerous incorrect statements about halal and kashrut food laws regarding Muslims and Jews respectively. Obviously, that interview attracted a lot of attention internationally, with many comparing her to Sarah Palin. Bannister said, "Unfortunately, they've completely twisted all my words and made me up to be a stand-up criminal and a stupid moron," which obviously they didn't do that. She managed to do that herself. But she claimed that she'd been misrepresented, with numerous corrections having been apparently edited out by the Fairfax media. Obviously, as you would expect, she withdrew from the election shortly afterwards. Anyway, that's not important right now. I just wanted you to know the party that this clown is representing in the Senate. So back to Roberts. His academic achievements, while impressive, are not in any way related to any scientific field. And again, we haven't got to the logical fallacies yet, so he's also an unqualified dumbass of the highest order. So let's get into the meat of it all.
I was going to start with Brian Cox. Can you provide scientific data or evidence that might help Barry Cassidy convince Malcolm over here that human-induced climate change is a reality?
Well, yes, and I could sit here and read out figures until I'm blue in the face. I mean, actually getting more worrying if you look at the temperature measurements now. I mean, 2015 and 2016 in particular have seen a quite shocking acceleration in many of the measures, be it surface temperatures, ocean temperatures, etc. So the first few months I noticed of 2016 have above the average, the pre-industrial average, have been pushing 1.5 degrees.
Sorry, I just wanted to stop it there to explain that the climate and temperature or weather are not the same thing. Weather is the short term and measures all sorts of things like temperature and humidity and rain and the cloudiness and brightness and visibility, wind, all the stuff that's happening in the atmosphere. Climate, on the other hand, is the average result of localized weather or global weather taking over a long period. So when somebody says in the middle of winter, when the ground is frozen over, oh, well, what about the global warming? Throw a shit-filled snowball at them for being silly. Okay, so back to Brian Cox.
Now, you can't read too much into individual years. You have to be careful because you see these graphs and they're spiky, but there's a clear rise. And it's in the early months of 2016 have already shown that. So we don't know how 2016 is going to continue. But that is a worrying problem.
Because what would happen if we reached 2%?
Oh, there are some shocking predictions, actually, that you see where places in the Middle East, for example, that are already experiencing temperatures sometimes in excess of 50 degrees, I think, this year, become essentially uninhabitable for certain periods of time. So it exacerbates, sea level rise, etc. So what it does, it exacerbates some of the problems we're seeing. We just spoke about refugee problems. If you begin to get large shifts in climate very fast, then human populations have to respond. So how do you respond on very short timescales? One of the things you do is you move.
So I think that's pretty clear, and Professor Cox does go on for a bit, but essentially he lays down the facts and the figures that we have empirical evidence for. So we should start with one of the first logical fallacies that I can be quite guilty of, and that's the argument from authority or the appeal to authority. And that's the logical fallacy that argues that a position is true or more likely to be true because an authority figure agrees with it. So the question is, should I believe in what Professor Cox is saying because he's a pretty clever guy? Better yet, if I say to you, Brian told me so, ergo it's true and you must believe it. Carl Sagan wrote of arguments from authority. One of the greatest commandments of science is mistrust arguments from authority. Too many such arguments have proved to be painfully wrong. Authorities must prove their contentions like everybody else. But this gives us a bit of a problem. It's a logical fallacy in itself because even with my very impressive 146 IQ...
You had to get that in, didn't you?
Oh, I had to put it somewhere. I hold that Cox and Sagan and Albert and Isaac are orders of magnitude smarter than nearly everybody else in the planet. And granted, Sagan said the authorities must prove their contentions, but at what stage can I say then, well, if Brian is saying it and Dr. Carl agrees, given that neither of them have ever led me astray, why can't I just take it as written? And of course, the obvious answer is it stops them from saying because I said so. But let's go back to the audio and see what happens next. Now, this next bit is about 2 minutes long, but there's some important context in this bit.
I'm going to go quickly to Malcolm Roberts. We want to hear from all the panellists on this.
Sure. The longest temperature record for temperatures on this planet is the Central England temperature record, which goes back to the mid-1600s. And the latest in the 17th century, the latest warming cycle in the 17th century going into the 18th century was faster and greater than the latest warming, which finished in 1995. And Justin Bieber wasn't flying his private jet around in the 1600s. That's the first thing. The second thing was we've had a pause in this so-called warming for now 21 years. Depends how you measure it, 21 years. And I'm absolutely stunned that someone who is inspired by Richard Feynman, a fantastic scientist who believes in empirical evidence, is quoting consensus.
Can I just say, I brought the graph, right? I mean, can I just... I'll just tell you where the pause is.
Okay, so to avoid any confusion, Professor Cox brings the evidence with him. But what Roberts did there, and I think he did very poorly, is something that a lot of alt-med purveyors do. They try a thing called proof by verbosity or proof by intimidation, submissions of others to an argument too complex to reasonably deal with in all of its intimate details in a very short time. And it's very similar to what they call the Gish Gallop, where the person just runs data and words and total BS at 1,000,000 miles an hour so that no one has an opportunity to get a word in. But then we get to look at the evidence.
The pause that's often quoted, there's if you take this point here, which is about 1997, I think, and you ignore 2015, 2016, you can choose that point and you can draw a slightly straighter trend line on there. But that's a misunderstanding. The question is, does that rise? And also, secondly, I brought another graph because I thought, is it correlated with that, which is the graph that shows the CO2 emissions, the CO2 in parts per million in the atmosphere. And you see that peak there, where it goes flying up. So the question essentially is, first of all, are those two things correlated? And secondly, do we understand the physical mechanisms? And we understood those since the 19th century.
Brian,
I mean, I can teach you. I can give you a lesson if you want. I can give you.
Can you go back to the middle of the graph there?
Yeah. That graph.
Yeah, the peak in the middle. What year is that?
That's about 1941.
Yeah, 1930s and 40s were warmer than the current decades. Where's that?
Well, no,
what's the data source?
Well, not exactly.
No, the original records are. The original records are far warmer. But the other thing that tells me that graph has got something wrong with it is that 1998 was about the same as 2015-16.
Okay, so I'll put a link to a shorter video in the show notes. I'll put a link for the full conversation, but there was a shorter video as well. And if you scrub to 5 minutes 32 in the shorter video and pause, you can see the chart. And what Roberts is doing there, well, to put it bluntly, he's talking out of his arse. Firstly, he asserts that the last few decades had the same annual mean as 1941. And there was a strange peak in 41, but the temperature anomaly for 41 was about 0.3. They call it an anomaly of 0.3. But the following years, it dropped back down in line with the curve to an average between the 40s and the 1970s of a 0.1 to a 0.2 anomaly.
Are you basically saying there then that that he's picking out like an individual peak year as opposed to looking at over a long period of time to see a trend?
Exactly, but what he did, there was a peak there, and he's drawn attention to the peak, but then bullshitted about what it means. So he's saying that. So what he said was that the last few decades have been the same. The climate was the same as it was for 1941, and you can clearly see.
So he's picked that 1 year.
Yeah, but it's not even close. So in the anomaly between the 40s and the 70s so that includes 1941, not including the peak. The anomaly was 0.1 to 0.2. The peak was a little bit higher than 0.3, if I'm fair. But since 2000, so if we call since 2000 the last few decades, it's gone from 0.8 to 0.9. So he's literally talking out of his arse.
Literally.
Yeah. And then he tries to challenge a data source. So it's that Gish Gallop again. He keeps throwing in the questions without giving anybody a chance to actually, answer the questions. I don't recall the logical fallacy that defines talking shit, but he has done the same as walking outside and claiming that the sky is green. But Professor Cox is holding the chart and everybody can see it, and Roberts is claiming that it's something completely different. And to try and get away with it, what he makes is an absolute bullshit statement. And as I said, rather than let anybody answer the question, he goes on an irrelevant rant about the quality of the data. And that's not a logical fallacy. That's just blatant trickery. But there's more.
Okay, I'm just going to pause here. So you're hearing.
It was an El Nino year.
Both were El Nino years.
Malcolm, just 1 second. You're hearing the interpretation of a highly qualified scientist, and you're just saying, "I don't believe it." Is that right?
I'm saying two things. I'm saying two things. First of all, that the data has been corrupted, and we know that the 1930s were warmer than today.
Yeah. Corrupted? What do you mean corrupted?
Been manipulated by NASA.
For fuck's sake. And honestly, if it was anyone else, I would just walk away in amusement. But this is a senator. This is a member of the upper house. Let's hear some more.
That the data has been corrupted, and we know that the 1930s were warmer than today.
Yeah. Corrupted? What do you mean corrupted?
Been manipulated
by
NASA.
NASA?
Yes.
The people laughing in the background.
I'm going to just ask the audience, just hang on. We've actually got to hear what's being said here. So it's all very well to laugh, but we want to hear what's being said.
No, keep
Steve
laughing
Goddard,
at him.
He has shown the NASA figures, and the graph was originally showing that 1930s were warmer than recent decades, and that is correct.
Except for it's not, and Professor Cox has the figures in front of him. And just for clarity, Steve Goddard is a pseudonym for some guy that has a blog. He's not a scientist. He's not a climate scientist. He's a guy with a blog.
Why does he want to so strongly disagree? What is he? Is it because he's against investment in?
Well, he was a manager, and he's got interest in coal mining.
Right. Okay.
So
right.
Coal mining
has an effect on the environment.
Exactly. Yeah. And it seems that anybody that the big voices, I should say.
Did you say he was on some kind of board for the Montessori education?
Yeah.
Oh, great! Educate the young at this stage.
Exactly.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah.
Can I just check one thing? NASA. Now NASA.
Yes.
The people that landed men on the moon. I should just ask. Actually, you believe we landed men on the moon? But,
see the little trick there?
No.
It's questioning whether or not I believe that I'm a moon skeptic. Now,
are you?
No, I'm not.
Oh, right. No, but I mean, it's a serious accusation. I mean, the idea that NASA and presumably, I should say to people, by the way, that the Australian Academy of Science have done a brilliant. You can never get any sense on programs like this. They're adversarial and things. But the Science of Climate Change, the Australian Academy of Sciences report is superb. I brought it because I'm going to come and give it to you in a minute, so you can have a read. But that's very good if you want to see that.
Okay, so let's stop there for a second. Professor Cox makes a brilliant comment there about how programs like the one that he's on are adversarial. And you can ask the obvious question is why does it go on them? Well, that aside, we see more and more where programs feel that they need to now show balance. We see it here on the BBC all the time. The thing is, if the counter argument is bollocks, then the media don't actually have to present the other side. Can you imagine bringing in a pro-regicide advocate onto Panorama or something like that? And the problem is that actual scientists aren't normally very well versed at rhetoric. They are good at science, and it's the deniers or the fools that are not good at science but are very good at the rhetoric. And they will argue all day long that the scientists are wrong and generally win a debate like this on TV and turn it into a populist argument. Now, in the next clip, and we're nearly done, but in the next clip, you'll hear a thud and a thunderous applause, and that's where Professor Cox throws a pile of papers at Malcolm Roberts, and that's the actual report, the evidence that he's talking about.
As far as I'm concerned, politics should be based on empirical evidence. All policy should be based on empirical evidence. I've heard consensus, which is not science. I've heard appeals to authority, which is not science. I've heard various illusions. Hang on. I've heard. Hang on. Hang on, Brian. You showed me a graph of temperature.
Yeah, but I can show you.
You showed me a graph of temperature, but no one has ever explained cause and effect. What is important in science? One of your inspirers is Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman says it doesn't matter how beautiful, how emotional your theory. If the evidence does not suit, it is wrong. That's what Richard Feynman says. And what we need is not just empirical evidence.
Can I have 1 minute?
We need empirical. Hang on. We need empirical evidence that demonstrates and proves cause and effect.
Now, I'm a massive Richard Feynman fan, and I don't ever recall him saying that if the evidence doesn't suit. suit what? That's just cherry picking, you dumbass. And when Cox tries to correct him, he word blocks him again. Thankfully, the Feynman lectures are still available on YouTube. And this is what Feynman actually says about evidence.
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are who made the guess or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it.
Now, anyway, so like I said, this went on for some time. The whole discussion just on climate change is nearly 30 minutes. So let's just leave it for there. But let's finish off with a question from the audience. And like I say, if you want to see the full discussion, I'll put the links on the show notes, and there'll be a longer version and the shorter version. But let's listen to the very last question on the subject.
Now, our next question comes from Adam Selinger.
Oh, thank you. So in the beginning, there were experts and there were celebrities. And then the experts became celebrities, Sir David, Ryan, and celebrities became experts, often in fields where they had very little experience. There are now elected policy makers suggesting that perhaps we need not listen to experts anyway because their views are no more important than anyone else's. So my question is, who should we listen to in order to make informed decisions, contribute to sensible comment about important matters such as climate change, immigration, census data, and not simply follow the panicked herd? Who do we listen to?
The evidence.
The experts. The experts with the evidence?
Yeah, the experts with the evidence.
That will do it. Okay, so I've not really done much this week in regards to talking about news. I figured Brian Cox, the actual scientist teaching the politician about actual science, was a bit more important. And for me, to be honest, it was a little bit more entertaining. And the final thought on that before I go on, it would be brilliant to think that Professor Cox would have changed some minds, or that Malcolm Roberts supporters would have seen him for what he is. But it's frustrating to know that that's just not the case at all. And Andy hit the nail on the head a bit when she said that sometimes we skeptics follow blindly, and that's just something we need to make sure we check ourselves on. But more than that, it's the believers in the bullshit that seem to never want to change their minds. And how often have we seen this? Or when you think about it, when we've got the likes of Edzard Ernst and Britt Hearns, both people that I admire greatly, but both of them come from the alt-med world, when both of them realised that it was just a big pile of woo. And now both are working hard to educate others. But unfortunately, the vast majority of people that believe in alt-med, like homeopathy or cupping, seem to think that chemtrails are a thing and climate change is a hoax perpetrated by NASA. Now, hopefully in a few weeks' time, Andy and I are going to talk about a documentary called Kumare, and I won't spoil it too much if you haven't seen it. And if you haven't seen it, I really recommend that you do. But it's essentially about a guy that sets himself up as a fake guru, and along the way he collects 14 disciples and have them believe that he's the real deal. Now, to be fair, he never actually teaches them anything that's not true. His premise all along is that they are the guru and he's not. He does make up some bullshit chants and creates his own form of yoga, which includes air guitaring. But to be fair, that's all any other guru actually does anyway. So after some time, he reveals himself, and you wouldn't believe it, but 10 of his disciples remain loyal to him, believing that no matter what he says, he is a spiritual being that's there to guide them. And this probably sounds like I'm being a bit negative, and that's not the case. There will have been millions of people watch the ABC show that Professor Cox was on, and amongst the diehard skeptics and the cynics and the believers of NASA conspiracies, there will have been scores more that had their eyes open for the first time. And for that same reason, I do what I do. Okay, let's finish off with some news. And talking about space cadets, astronauts on the ISS took a 6-hour spacewalk to touch a new docking system for private parking. And this is the first of 2 spaces to be installed to be used by commercial aircraft. And I can hear you asking, why can't they use the current spaces? Well, the current system is referred to as a grapple and berthing system, and while it does have some automation, there's a lot of manual work involved where the pilots need to deal with certain situations. And when things don't go 100% perfectly, they need to completely take over, as we saw last year with Tim Peake. Now, the new system is fully automatic and will be used by Boeing and SpaceX as early as next year. And while we're in space, let's talk about the ESA. They have discovered a planet in its star's habitable zone around Proxima Centauri, making it the closest an Earth-like habitable planet could possibly be to our own solar system. And that's just because Proxima Centauri is the closest star to our own at 4.25 light years away. And while that's bloody close on a galactic scale, given that the Milky Way is about 100,000 light years across, or for those that understand that a parsec is a measure of distance and not time, I'm talking to you, Han Solo, 100,000 light years is about 30 kiloparsecs across. Or, to put it another way, with current technology, it would take about 150,000 years to reach this newly discovered planet. So the best we can do for now is hope that we can detect some sort of signs of life, intelligent or Earth-like. Because if we do, just imagine what that means. If we discover life around our closest neighbouring star, the closest and therefore the easiest planet to study outside of our own system, let me take a step back. As it stands, the science people are pretty confident that they know where they should be looking within our own solar system for life outside of Earth. Nothing yet, but they know where and what to look for. And that's going to be brilliant if that discovery is made. But that will not give us any assurance that life can exist outside of our own system. But if we can find life, even flora or bacteria or virus, outside of our solar system, that can only mean that life can very most probably exist everywhere in the universe. And what a question that would be to answer. Okay, very quickly on Loser Donald. Now, he has shocked a few people this week by essentially making an apology for some, and I just say some, of his behaviour. And while he didn't go into specifics, it did for some part actually seem a little bit heartfelt of an apology from a creature that I still attest has no heart. Have a listen to what he said.
Sometimes in the heat of debate and speaking on a multitude of issues, you don't choose the right words or you say the wrong thing. I have done that, and believe it or not, I regret it. And I do regret it, particularly where it may have caused personal pain.
Now, I think I'm going to give him the benefit of doubt on this one. I think, and I have nothing to back this up, it's just my conjecture, but I think this is in relation to his treatment of the Khan family. And when you look at the video, I do think there's a smidgen of human feelings in his voice. But have a listen to the crowd. They are laughing and cheering. They think he's joking. And afterwards, they start the Trump, Trump, Trump chant. That's normally the soundtrack to a protester getting beaten up and thrown out by security staff. Okay, so at home, the kingdom has gone silent on the Brexit front. A little because our now new Lord and Commander has decided she needs to take a summer holiday just 4 weeks into her new gig. And who did she hand over the con to? Boris fucking Johnson. Okay, so he has no actual powers. He gets to answer the phone and take messages, but seriously, Boris fucking Johnson. Anyway, it looks like the timetable for negotiating the withdrawal from the EU could be hampered a little bit by a High Court challenge this October. Campaigners who claim the Prime Minister needs Parliament's backing before starting formal talks have raised £32,000 towards their £50,000 initial legal cost from 840 people through crowdfunding. And as such, are fairly confident that their so-called People's Challenge will go ahead. Now, T-Dog is expected to trigger Article 50 next year, which will start 2 years of negotiations. The government has refused to promise MPs and peers, the peers of the Lords, a vote on the decision, fueling speculation that she may use royal prerogative under which the monarch's historic powers are exercised by ministers without needing Parliament's approval, which is about the only way they'll get the legislations needed passed, as more than two-thirds of MPs are still backing the Remain argument, and most of the Lords probably, as we understand, won't go against the popular public decision. Now, there are going to be many and several arguments on the use of royal prerogative also, but as it has its links back to Magna Carta, it gives the monarch claim to some, but only some, authority. However, it is essentially never actually been codified. So as it stands today, the prerogative is only given to the monarch as advice from the Prime Minister. Now, because of this, nearly every Prime Minister after Churchill thought that they have more power than the monarch, and this isn't the case. But more than that, the courts have the final word on everything. And ever since 1689, the Bill of Rights removed the ability of the Crown to ignore any legislation or statutes. Being that there was an act to enter the United Kingdom into the European Union, there has to be an act to leave. And that act, according to legislation itself, must be the result of a majority vote. Fuck me, I should have been one of them constitutional law-talking people. I wonder what they're called. Well, I think that's about enough from me for now. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, if I've upset you, but you know the law is the law. So, Your Highness, don't forget to look out for new shows each Monday evening UK time, which will eventually be on all other platforms, hopefully for Tuesday morning for your commute to the palace. Now, if you want to keep in touch, you can follow and like the show on all the social networks that allow following and liking, and you can get all the contact information you need at skepticsmashtalk.com. Also, if you want to hear your voice on the show, you can now send me a voice memo. Just keep it to less than about 45 seconds and remember to play nice. All you need to do is record your message on your phone's voice memo app and email it to the email link on the Skeptic Smash Talk homepage. Finally, I hope to have some more videos up on the YouTube channel next week, so if there's a segment or a story that you enjoyed and would like to see it animated, get in touch and I will see what I can do. Finally, if you did in fact enjoy the show, please take a moment to leave a review and the appropriate amount of stars on iTunes, where you can also find past and future episodes. But better still, if you really enjoyed the show, feel free to post the links and share all the information with all of your friends. So on behalf of myself and Andrea, thanks for listening, and until next time, this has been Skeptic Smash Talk episode 26.